Okay, it's been quite a while since I spoke about my 14-inch M3 Max MacBook Pro, which cost me an awful lot of money. So it's time for an update, and it's been both good and not so good. I wasn't convinced I was going to make another video about the MacBook Pro, and that's not because I don't use it anymore, because I do. It's used every single day in this business. It's an absolutely essential tool. The reason I wasn't going to revisit this on the channel, to cut to the chase, is because for some reason the interest levels in MacBook Pros dies off quite quickly compared to, let's say, the Mac Mini or the MacBook Air, which both of those machines seem to live long in the YouTube interest graphs. People love any sort of content about those two devices, computers, whatever they are. This, not so much. I don't really understand why, but equally, I know there's still a lot of people out there who are thinking about buying one of these. And because they are so astronomically expensive, I completely understand if you're taking your time with this decision. And if you want to hear from someone who's been using one of these for 7 months. That's what I've been doing, and I've got lots of thoughts. But before we get into that, just a very quick word from today's sponsor, which is RoboForm. And RoboForm is basically a password manager. If you are still storing your passwords in a spreadsheet, or even worse, on post-it notes and stuff, you need a password manager. So you can put your login details in there, your secret notes, basically anything digital that you want to hide away from prying eyes go into RoboForm. And if you work cross-platform, so if you've got a Mac, a Windows device, an Android phone, an iOS device, an iPad, etc., it works across all of them. And yes, RoboForm has a no breach history, which is very, very important. And RoboForm combines ease of use with incredible value for money. For instance, it has a one-click login feature which does exactly what it says on the tin. You just choose your favorite website or your favorite web app, and bosh, you're in. You can also share passwords with friends and family very securely, and there's an emergency access feature, which means if you, for whatever reason, can't get to your passwords, you have someone designated who can do it for you. They've even got full 24/7 support if anything goes wrong, which, in my experience with RoboForm, is very, very unlikely. The best news is I've got an incredible offer for you with RoboForm. It's an absolute no-brainer. Go and check it out. So for those who haven't been following my MacBook Pro journey, I should confirm that about 7 months ago, I went from the 16-inch version, the M1 Max 16-inch MacBook Pro, to this M3 Max 14-inch version. And the reason I did that is because I'm traveling more. I'm on planes, trains, automobiles, and walking around a lot in different countries and things, and I got no end of stick for this, but that 16-inch MacBook Pro became a massive burden. The footprint was just too big. I don't fly first class or business class, so I have to make do with those normal trays that most of us get on planes, and it didn't fit on them. The same thing with trains, which is a shame because it's an amazing laptop and I do miss certain elements of it, which I'll come on to in a moment. This is this is the replacement. And if you're wondering, it's the 14-inch MacBook Pro with the M3 Max chip, 16-core CPU, 40-core GPU, 64GB of unified memory, and a 2TB SSD. It cost me, I had to remind myself of this, £4,399. Was it the right thing to do? Yes and no. I'll come to the no bit in a moment, but in terms of the yes, I was right. That whole thing about the 16-inch MacBook Pro weighing me down, it was definitely a thing. I do go to the gym, etc, etc. It doesn't really weigh as much as a small country, which is something I said in a previous video. When you've got this in your backpack, it feels so much lighter, and it sits on those seat trays and pretty much any coffee shop table I've been to in the last 6 months. It hasn't been a burden at all. And also, in my opinion, I think the 14-inch MacBook Pro looks better. I think it suits this size. The whole, the new MacBook Pro design is better in 14-inch. Argue with me in the comments if you don't agree. It's got the slingability factor, which I've talked about before, which is basically that kind of thing. It just feels very satisfying to sling under your arm, whereas the 16-inch MacBook Pro is like slinging a small country under your arm. But there are two things that I miss from the 16-inch MacBook Pro. The first thing is that display, and that's for one very specific reason. I'm a video editor, so I edit these videos, and if I'm doing it in here in the studio, that's fine. I've got two great big BenQ monitors. If I'm editing at home in the kitchen, this is just a bit too small, which is why I use this with this, and this is oh, it's been a while, hasn't it, since this has been on the channel. Any excuse. Just check the front display isn't cracked. Vision Pro. So since I got Vision Pro, the only use case I've found for it really is using it in conjunction with the 14-inch MacBook Pro, because if you're not aware, you can basically put this on your head and then connect it to your Mac, and then take your Mac's display and put it into this massive virtual environment, which means I get around this display being a little bit too small. The only problem with that is that this is very heavy and uncomfortable, and £3,500 when it comes to the UK next month. So in terms of a workaround, it's a little bit elaborate. The second thing I miss, let me just put this away. The second thing I miss is the battery life, which I'll come on to in a moment. Before I get to the negatives about this laptop, let's talk about the things that I love. The first thing is the size, and I won't keep going on about this. The size of the 14-inch MacBook Pro is perfect. Then the display, which is in a class of its own. No, it's not OLED, and yes, it has a little cutout at the top, which some people seem to get immeasurably angry about. Trust me, if you're doing work on this thing, if you're actually doing stuff, you never notice that little notch. This is a beautiful display. ProMotion is a bit of a non-event, to be completely honest. You only spot it occasionally, and sometimes if I go back to my MacBook Air, I then spot that things aren't quite as smooth. That isn't the reason to buy this. It's just a brilliant display overall. Connectivity is still a massive highlight of this MacBook Pro. So we have MagSafe, yes, 3 Thunderbolt 4 ports, headphone jack, obviously, an SD card slot, which I use all the time. It's also got HDMI, which I never ever use, but it's nice to know it's there. And it's all this stuff that separates this from the MacBook Air. As much as I love that MacBook Air, this always feels like an absolute productivity beast. The other thing I've really enjoyed over the last 7 months is the black finish. This is the space black version, and the first thing people always ask with this sort of thing is, what are the smudges like? Does it pick up fingerprints really easily? And yes, it does pick up fingerprints because it's black. They've got this special coating on it, which is much better than whatever coating they used on the M2 MacBook Air. This is the Midnight, I think it was called, MacBook Air, which gets so fingerprinty so quickly. I can definitely confirm that although this still picks up fingerprints, they are so easy to wipe off, and they don't seem to be as noticeable as they are on that MacBook Air. But it hasn't been plain sailing with this machine, which brings me on to the negative parts of it, and the reason that I haven't spoken about performance yet. Okay, so this has a M3 Max chip in it, which is the reason it was so expensive. It's got the 16-core CPU and the 40-core GPU. I also chucked in 64 gig of unified memory and that 2TB SSD. And I did the same thing with the M1 Max 16-inch MacBook Pro. That was completely spec'd up, well, apart from the memory and the storage. You're probably wondering, is there any noticeable difference between this and that 16-inch MacBook Pro? No, there really isn't. I did a test a little while ago where I did like a render and an export test from Final Cut Pro. I can't even remember what the results are, but they don't really matter. It was seconds between the two machines. What matters is that everyday use. Does it feel any quicker? And the honest answer is not. No, not at all. If anything, at times it feels a bit more sluggish. This is a very specific issue I've found with Final Cut Pro. That is the software that I use to edit these videos. Two things. Firstly, the fans spin up much quicker on this than they ever did on the 16-inch MacBook Pro. That is to be expected. This is less thermally efficient because it's smaller. That's fine. The second thing is a bit more worrying, and it's that I've had these weird hangs and things happening in Final Cut Pro where it just isn't quite as, it doesn't feel quite as robust as it used to. And yes, this could be a software thing. There might have been a software update in between me switching from the big one to the little one, possibly, who knows. I'm not sure what it is, and it's not to the point where it's annoying or it's holding me back at all. I've just noticed that I seem to get a few more of those dreaded beach ball hangs when I'm editing fairly big timelines or when I'm exporting stuff. Then we have the battery life, which isn't as good as the 16-inch MacBook Pro. The battery life on that 16-inch MacBook Pro, certainly the M1 Max version, that's the only one that I've had experience of, is unbelievable. A caveat here, this is still wonderful when it comes to battery life. If you've come from a Windows laptop or an older Intel Mac, you will be absolutely bowled over by the battery life. I'm just talking as someone who's come from the 16-inch to the 14-inch, this is noticeably not as good. The last thing that I don't like about this laptop is the price. I've never spent that much money on a computer before. And yes, it's completely my choice. That isn't Apple's fault. It's what I decided to do. But that's what happens with the MacBook Pro. You pick the one that you think you want to go for, and then you think, I need more memory. Or, oh, storage. I know I can add external storage, but don't want to carry around all those SSDs. No, I'll put some more storage on. Oh, it gets very, very expensive. And if you take into account the fact that the MacBook Air is brilliantly capable, very few people need this much power. And then we have an iPad Pro, which has an M4 chip, which technically, and yes, I know you can't spec that thing up as much as you can one of these, but technically the new iPad Pro has a chip that is more capable, newer and better than the one in this. And that begs two questions. One, will I stick with the 14-inch MacBook Pro? And two, will I stick with a MacBook Pro at all? Let's answer both of those questions very quickly. The first one, will I stick with the 14-inch MacBook Pro? Yes. And I've had my fill of spending an absolute fortune on laptops. The second question, will I stick with the MacBook Pro? This is going to be a 3 to 4 year machine for me. That sounds like a long time, doesn't it? But then you start thinking, okay, what happens after that? You know, will I be in a place then, in let's say 3 years' time, where I can just start using a MacBook Air? And then you think, will we be in a position in 3 years' time where I can just use the iPad Pro? I've always been a MacBook Pro guy, and I don't want these laptops to get too expensive or too niche that I can't justify owning one. So in summary, in 7 months of using this laptop, one, the power it's enough for me. I just have those slight niggles in Final Cut Pro, which most people probably won't experience, so it's not a big deal. Two, Space Black doesn't smudge too much. Three, I could have bought a much cheaper, a much lower cost spec. Four, this size is perfect for me. And lastly, if you've been thinking about buying one of these for the last few weeks, the last few months possibly, just get it. However, if you're tempted to spend less money and get the M3 MacBook Air, keep watching for my full review.